Good evening and welcome to the first Daunt Books live event. Whilst we are sending out mail orders at the moment, we're of course really now looking forward greatly to being able to welcome you all back to our shops before too long. And in the meantime, sit back and enjoy tonight's first tentative dip into the world of online talks. The first of many, we hope. And it is a real treat tonight as we welcome one of our finest satirists, Craig Brown, to talk about 1, 2, 3, 4, his highly entertaining kaleidoscopic portrait of the Beatles, a portrait which, like his best-selling book on Princess Margaret, Mom Darling, is full of wonderful anecdote, forgotten marginal figures, alternative sliding door moments, and a playful, roving, and highly observant eye, as always. Welcome, Craig, if you're there.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be back with Dawn.
It's super to be here, albeit in a sort of alternative reality. And we're delighted that Craig tonight is joined by Lucy Kellaway, award-winning columnist at the FT. She is also a teacher and indeed co-founder of Now Teach, which is a charity aiming to encourage teaching as a highly rewarding second career. Lucy, welcome if you're there as well. Good evening.
Thank you very much. Not doing much teaching at the moment.
No, indeed.
So lots of time to do.
Indeed, lots of time to read and listen to music appropriately for tonight. Now, before we just begin, there will be a chance for some questions after half an hour or so of chat. And indeed, we've had some come in beforehand, so thank you for those. And just say Craig has also signed copies of 1, 2, 3, 4 via book plates, and they're available now on our website. Lucy, over to you. I will take myself off and leave the stage to both of you. Thank you both.
Thanks very much. Greg, I should tell you, I'm not actually interested in the Beatles. I did like them when I was a child, but then as soon as I became a teenager and got a bit cooler, I obviously converted to the Rolling Stones on account of them being better and cooler. So I wasn't that interested then. Now a lot of time has passed. I gather that your publishers wanted to dash this out because it's 50 years since the Beatles split up. What's happened in that time is that I haven't got all that more interested, but that every damn person has written a book about the Beatles, either singly or collectively. There is so much stuff out there. And your kaleidoscopic book, I gather, adds nothing new. I mean, you haven't done any primary research. It's just a whole lot of recycled anecdotes. And if that wasn't bad enough, oh my God, I've got it here. It is 600 and something pages. No index, which is annoying. 628 pages. Anyway, so that was my view until I started reading it. Oh, God.
I knew it would be a happy ending.
There was a happy ending. Oh my God. It is the ideal lockdown book. I laughed and laughed and laughed. And now, so weirdly, I am celebrating the 50 years since they broke up as being a true Beatles fan. Only this afternoon, I've been dancing around the kitchen, driving my family mad, singing along to Bungalow Bill, which I despised at the time.
That's a very little known one. Yeah. Good.
Anyway, I'm not going to offer to sing it now. But yeah, so there are all of what you've done so brilliantly is what you did last time with Princess Margaret, and readers who love that won't be at all surprised. Here we go again. It's all of these anecdotes. You seem to have gone through all the bloody books, found the things that were either the weirdest or the funniest, and stitched them all together deadpan. It absolutely works as a format. But I wondered for you how different those two projects were. Because with one, you've chosen people who everyone, apart from me, but pretty much everyone else absolutely adores. And with the other, you were in the company of someone who practically nobody adored, and those who didn't adore her for very long.
Yeah, they were very different. When I was writing the Princess Margaret book, people say, "Oh, what are you doing?" And I was saying, writing a book about Princess Margaret, and there would never be a question that followed. They just sort of changed the subject. I think people just thought, "Oh, well, he must be doing it for money or something." They couldn't see the point of that. Whereas if you say the Beatles, straight away everyone's interested. Everyone, it reminds them of their childhood or their teenage years. Everyone has a favorite Beatle. A lot of people, like you, want to stress the fact that they prefer the Rolling Stones. So that rivalry, even though it's 50 years since the Beatles split up, that rivalry still goes on. And people think that it's somehow clever. People like you who want to be seen as clever, they say, "Oh, I prefer the Rolling Stones," and it's a very big thing. Or they be cooler, and I don't know. People like boasting that they're not just part of the run-of-the-mill Beatles fan. I'll tell you.
We can get onto the Stones in. Yeah, sorry.
I would just say there's obviously huge differences between Princess Margaret and the Beatles, but with one, I now think that the central difference is, well, Princess Margaret was born with everything, and so her life was a sort of decline, and none of the potential was realised. And the Beatles is the opposite. They came from absolutely nowhere, and then they owned the world, and so that they are completely opposite.
Actually, talking about coming from nothing, one of my favourite bits in the book was, I suppose, original in that it involved you going to Liverpool to visit their early houses. Do you want to just tell us a bit about that visit?
Yes. Oh my God, Tom. Okay, sorry, I've lost you.
Oh.
Hang on.
Who have you lost, Craig? You've lost Lucy.
Hang on, Mike.
You're still there.
Yeah. Oh, you can see me, can you?
We can see you. We can hear you. I think you've turned another version of yourself on, so you're still there, though.
I can still see you.
While I was panicking, you could see me.
But you can't hear anybody.
It's a weird sound coming.
Reverb.
Actually, I'm finding this very reassuring because I'm usually the most technologically incompetent person around. So to find myself trumped by Craig is very, very reassuring.
How's that? No, not happy.
No.
There we are. Are you there?
Yeah. Okay.
There's two of you. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear.
We can see you, but you've got two versions of yourself. You've got something else showing the screen, showing the noise, hearing the noise.
And then
you're playing and recording at the same time. We can hear you and we can see you.
Okay. That sounds.
There's a weird echo.
Should I try taking it somewhere else in the house?
Yeah, I think
if we can we log out and log in again?
Yes, we can do that. Yeah, absolutely. We'll chat briefly and insult the Beatles and
I'll start readings or something.
Okay, we could chat and insult the Beatles. Alternatively, I could find, if I can find my absolutely favourite piece in this, I can read it. Should I do that?
You absolutely. Before we do that, we've got a rather nice comment here from Peter Hart, who says, "When you're faced with reverb, take the chance to say hello Wembley," which I think is excellent advice for Craig. I think we'll get him to say hello Wembley when he comes back. Let's see if we've got him back. Let's try if that's better.
Oh yeah.
How are you doing now?
Can you see
That's
it?
much better.
Yeah, you can hear
All
me.
good? Yep, carry on. You're all good.
Okay.
Great. Okay,
Sorry
that
about
was really good. Craig, you just saved me from having to read from the book myself. So instead of that, what I was talking about was your trip back to Liverpool at the beginning of the book,
yes.
when you go and visit the childhood homes of Paul and John.
Yes, and I mean the marvelous thing about writing is that you can get your own back on people. Someone defined it as turning your worst experiences into money. And I had actually about 10 years ago gone around John and Paul's houses, but I did this time with a notebook. But the man and the woman, husband and wife, who was showing me around, one does John's house, one does Paul. but they both really objected to me taking notes, and so I put that in the book. This altercation, because the Beatles have become so much part of the heritage that their houses are owned by John and Paul's houses are owned by the National Trust. And they even have a catalogue with things like the dustbin, which is just a replica. You know, it's like they might have had, or everything is being changed in houses. But unlike any other National Trust property I've been in before, you can't take photographs, you can't take notes, you can't. It's become such a sort of reverent site, which I think is a bit daft. Anyway, so I have.
If people feel that, maybe we should honour it. I mean, I was sneering snobbishly with you about the sort of fake dustbins and the fake Ovaltine, but maybe if people love that, it's fine, and we should be less sneering.
No, I do think there's something very, and I felt this the first time I went to their houses. There is some. I think they should be owned by the National Trust, and I'm all for that. And there is something very moving about seeing these comparatively modest houses that they grew up in, and then the way they sort of changed the world. I mean, it is extraordinary. I think they're more interesting than most stately homes, a lot more interesting. Yeah. So I'm not against that. It's just that undue reverence and everything being a reproduction and or take photographs. It just seems absurd.
Yeah, you certainly didn't make me want to go to Liverpool to visit the houses. I took your word for it. But what about your own childhood and the Beatles? I love the bits of you at prep school going into this den called the Cavern, and in the dark trying to listen to Revolution 9.
After finishing the book, I think that I realised that the Cavern this was a kind of underground room that they'd converted into, they'd had table tennis and things like that for these 10-year-olds. And they called it the Cavern, and it obviously was in homage to the Beatles, but it hadn't, all this time, it hadn't struck me that it was in homage. And as far as I can remember, there was a mural of octopuses, and I think there was a yellow submarine. So obviously someone on the staff had a kind of Beatles thing in mind. This would have been 1968, 69, so it was quite kind of hip of them in a way, given that it was a very traditional school. And so I have a chapter on listening. It was a Catholic school, so we were singing this song Tantum Ergo at benediction twice a week, and I link that in with hearing Lady Madonna on a builder's radio at the same time. And also it was while the Beatles, John in particular, was becoming more and more interested in nonsense, and so their lyrics were becoming more nonsensical, and these Latin hymns were, of course, nonsensical to little boys who couldn't understand Latin. And so it's a little essay on nonsense, the position of nonsense in.
How did you feel about the nonsense? I mean, I loathed it as a child, and I'm still not that keen on it, but I sort of rather judged from your book that you rather loved I Am the Walrus.
Yes, I do. I think it, logically it shouldn't. You shouldn't like it because you just see these things and you think, well, I could have just bunged in any old words. But of course, I Am the Walrus has now become so famous that even if you don't like it, it takes on a meaning because everyone has heard it throughout their lives and it's known internationally. So in a way, if you said I'm an elephant or I'm a tin of baked beans, it would still have some kind of meaning. Because that's the way the world works. I mean, it's unfair on those groups who might have almost done better songs, but never got into the top 20, so no one ever heard them. And so they are now meaningless, the singles. But
as you point out hilariously, the songs that they actually wrote aren't necessarily the words that they wrote aren't necessarily the same as the words that people actually hear. I loved the mishearings, which was Friday Night Arrives Without a Fruitcake. I thought it was very funny.
There were lots, and even now, if I put in Beatles lyrics, I'm sort of surprised by it ones. I mean, it would apply even more to your favourite group, the Rolling Stones, because Mick Jagger has his diction is less good than Paul or John's.
But the funniest one was, and when I get home to you, I find a broken canoe. It was really
Yeah, these. I mean, some of the ones were my mishearings, and some that I just sort of got online and in there are endless sort of chat groups and things about the Beatles. And I think these were all genuine mishearings. And yeah, they take it on their own nonsensical meanings.
You've mentioned Mick Jagger and the Stones, and so have I. So I think we really need to have this out. I was furious with the treatment that you gave them. You went on and on about how the Stones had copied the Beatles at almost every stage.
No,
and then
it was. I think, oddly enough, this argument has surfaced only about 2 weeks ago. Mick Jagger got cross when Paul McCartney said, I mean, you know, these are men in their late 70s. Paul McCartney mentioned the Beatles were always copying. I think you can, you know, if you just got a historian to look through chronologically what the Stones were doing, what the Beatles, you could see that that after the Beatles did All You Need Is Love, then, you know, miraculously 3 or 4 months later, the Stones did We Love You, and they were always love
wasn't exactly, but hang on, love isn't an original topic to come up in a pop song. Practically every pop song ever has the word love.
They're very similar, and they wanted a kind of worldwide anthem and that kind of thing. And their album covers, and I'm afraid it's just a fact. I mean, I really like the Stones, and I mean, unlike one of the oddities about the Beatles is they hardly did a song you can dance to. Though you managed to dance to Bungalow Bill, whereas the Stones is a kind of dance group. It's hardly a song you can't dance to. Maybe
I don't know. I did feel that that every time you mentioned Mick Jagger, there he was rather sappishly sort of hanging on at parties, always with Marianne Faithfull in tow, never having anything sort of.
I wasn't. I mean, it's like people said about Princess Margaret that I was mean to Princess Margaret, but actually I was just presenting all the information. So this was. I
Okay.
mean, I don't think that. I think it'd be hard to come up with an argument. The Stones were ahead of the Beatles at any time, actually.
Okay, all right. Well, let's not have that. Instead, if we're arguing about unfair treatment, I thought one of the most outrageous things about the book was the favoritism to different members of the Beatles. So Ringo gets the most fabulous treatment throughout. Even when you're comparing the Beatles' Christmas messages to the Queen's Christmas messages, Ringo comes out on top. He's Mr. Lovely, Mr. Sane, Mr. Funny. Did you start off being a massive Ringo fan, or did you become one as
No, I wasn't that interested in Ringo.
No.
But I just you know, doing all the research, you just realise that he had a lot of qualities. He's always the overlooked one. You know, he's the less attractive.
Well, no longer, thanks to 1, 2, 3, 4.
Though oddly enough, the reviewer in the Times said that I was mean to Ringo. I mean, I couldn't quite understand that, but he did. I suppose, you know, he was a bit dimmer than quite substantially dimmer than the other three. But I think he always sort of brought them down to earth in some funny way. And he would see when they were all getting, to a greater or lesser extent, fooled by the sort of charlatans and the Maharishi type of people, or Magic Alex. He wasn't. And I think that's rather, he's a kind of Dr. Watson figure, and the other three are Sherlock Holmes kind of figures. You need a Dr. Watson.
Well, I thought he came out absolutely delightfully. But one thing that puzzled me was, why was George Harrison so almost completely absent in this? I thought that there was far less. You were slightly bored by him.
I was, to be honest. I mean, I just nothing he did really interested me. And I know there are a lot of Beatles, George fans, and I mean he gets a fair crack of the whip, but he doesn't. It doesn't strike me that that without John and Paul, George would have had a sort of solo career. I mean, he was a perfectly good musician. He might have joined, the Searchers or something like that. And yet he's not. You could say the same of Ringo, though Ringo was a very good drummer. But George could be fooled into things. So he was as gullible as the others, but without the
He was a sort of
but I don't.
horrific-
I mean, I'm not anti him in the book. I just slightly ignore him, as you say.
Yes, exactly. And I thought slightly ignoring one of the four felt a bit weird. I mean, he does make some fantastic cameos. I love the bit of him consulting his mum for a suitable rhyme in Little Piggies. So
Yes, actually, the one thing, if though I don't do this in the book, because obviously there were attractive things about George, but I think as a lyricist, he was very, very poor. Even the song Something is obviously a really good song, but the lyrics lack.
While my guitar gently weeps.
That's a beautiful song. I quite agree. No, I like that.
Yeah. So I think lyrics not bad.
Yeah, no, that might be the exception.
And that was about his sadness at the breakup, no?
No, because it came quite some time. I mean, they weren't getting on, but they hadn't broken up.
But just back to Ringo for a minute. Another great bit was Jimmy, spelt with an IE, Jimmy Nicol, yes. the drummer who took over when Ringo had appendicitis. I felt so sorry for him. He was such a pathetic character. But I wondered if Ringo had stayed out of action, if he could have, if the Beatles would have gone on being just as famous with the dreaded Jimmy Nicol.
Yes, I don't think. I mean, it was an awful story. I think one of the features of my book is I rather home in on these people who sort of rubbed shoulders with the Beatles and were often not the victim of the Beatles, but just somehow the Beatles' success kind of ruined their lives in a way. It's obviously applied to some of the old guard pop stars. But Jimmy Nicol was this man who, within 24 hours, just plucked from nowhere to substitute for Ringo at the height of their fame for 10 days. He went on tour with them to Australia and Scandinavia. And it did kind of ruin his life because he came back having experienced all this sort of worship, and he was allowed into the press conference and everything. So he became a proper Beatle. And then it just went to his head. He then formed his own group, paid them too much, went bankrupt, left his wife, went to Mexico for years, and is now occasionally, the last sighting is like Loch Ness Monster or something. The last sighting was about 10 years ago at a Beatles fan club convention in Amsterdam. Someone thought they saw him in the back of the room. And so there are these sad stories,
but not all of them were sad. And I mean, I love that in the book about how many you're not just talking about Muhammad Ali and the Queen. There are so many randomers in the book, and some of the randomers. Go on.
One I start with, almost in the first chapter or first 2 or 3 chapters, Malcolm Muggeridge, who had slightly forgotten figure now, but was a great kind of sage of TV. But he had a great knack of being at the right place at the right time, like a good journalist. And by chance, he had walked into the club in Hamburg where they were playing at the beginning of 1962, or even earlier, I think. And so he'd seen the Beatles, and they'd recognized him. He was the first famous person they'd ever seen. And he thought that they were like sort of cherubs, which of course they weren't at that time or at any other time. But I liked that these them brushing shoulders with, or like Noel Coward and people like that. Just all peculiar. And almost every politician wanted to be, to be part of their gang, and so all the politicians were sucking up to them, and they met.
But I like the real randomers too, the people who were picked up off the street to be in the Hey Jude video. And the Beatles didn't then ruin their lives. It sprinkled stardust on them forever, really. Yes,
and I watched I really recommended actually watching the Hey Jude video, because first I've
watched it about 20 times since then. I've watched nothing else. In fact, but what is so interesting is I look at that Hey Jude video and think this is genius. It's so natural and it's so great. And I showed it to my kids who thought it was rubbish, absolute rubbish. I didn't see it at all. So, and just said that video making techniques have moved on a lot since then. So,
yes, well, they should look at. I find a lot of those Beatles videos I mean, they're also, your children would understand that they were pioneering.
Yeah.
I'm getting odd feedback. Are you getting it? Anyway, we'll plow on.
We'll plow on. But you have, towards the end, you have this chapter, sort of as if chapter, as if it hadn't been the Beatles, but it had been Jerry and the Pacemakers who had become global sensations. Yes. And that reads sort of, I mean, it's very funny, but reads ridiculous, as that wasn't what happened. Did you think that ever could have happened? Did you have a view on that?
No, I sort of, with that chapter, it's only a short chapter, but I thought maybe people expected it of me to do those sort of, because I'd done it a bit with Princess Margaret, and maybe I shouldn't have done it. But I mean, there were so many groups on Merseyside, and Jerry and the Pacemakers were sort of preceded the Beatles. So, and there were all these groups which were vying for each other, and there is something random about the Beatles. That's not to detract from Paul and John's geniuses, but you know, some kind of magic happened to them. One of the obvious things was Brian Epstein taking them over, and I think if he hadn't walked into the cabin that time and decided that, they could easily have gone to nothing. And the earlier recordings, you know, pre Love Me Do, are very unexceptional.
And the role of Brian Epstein in this is very good, but I didn't end up feeling that their success was random at all. So what the book made me do was see how special they were, really.
Yeah,
and,
I agree. I know. I think it was only at the very beginning. I think they might not have ever been discovered. I mean, Brian Epstein really went around every record company trying to get them, and they all turned them down. It was quite random that they ever got a record in the first place. But obviously, after 1964, they were just way ahead of everyone.
But what happened was so sad, and there's a brilliant picture. Have you got it, Craig? Can you show it of what happened to them in 5 years? It shows them as the sort of happy mopheads, and then the sort of druggy, miserable, or a bit further away from the camera, a bit further away. Yeah, stop. So you've got the sort of drug down at the bottom, the druggy, miserable version from 1979, and the happy version from 1965. I thought that was very telling and very sad. And as you point out, they'd all aged.
I mean, yes, there is something sad that it all came to an end and it became fractious and they took too many drugs and things. But I think in another way, you know, unlike the Rolling Stones, if we go to the Rolling Stones, the Rolling Stones have just dragged on as, in a way, their own tribute act. You know, so they just do old songs from roughly the Beatles period. Not very many after that. Whereas I think, at least with the Beatles, they had a beginning and a middle and an end. And that also makes them perfect for a book. I mean, obviously they then had their individual lives, but there was something very nice about it just taking place from kind of 62 to 1970 in this very brief moment of time.
You allowed Yoko Ono to stray into the book rather more than some might have liked, whereas Linda McCartney is entirely absent. Why did you decide to do that? I mean, Yoko makes better copy, obviously.
Throughout the book, there have been so many books, as you mentioned, written about the Beatles, which tell you the story completely straight and they get everything exactly on an even plan. I wanted to just pursue my own interests. And I've always been intrigued by Yoko and intrigued by the way her reputation has continued to sort of flourish in a way. So I thought she deserved a bit of a takedown.
I had no idea what a rich girl she was. A lot of that was completely new to me. But the thing I loved best was the idea that if she had married Ringo, her ghastly, pretentious poems would have been a lot less ghastly and pretentious. I thought that was very nice.
There's one funny fact. She always claimed that I think this was a false claim, but she claimed that she didn't know any of the Beatles before she met John. the only one she'd ever heard of was Ringo. And there's an odd little coincidence that Ringo in Japanese is Japanese for apple. So that's a peculiar little
another spooky
factoid.
fact. What was it about the Beatles that made people so spooky and so full of conspiracy nonsense and so longing to play the records backwards?
Well, they were so much part of their time. And I think, 68, 67, 68, 69, a lot of drugs being taken, not just by the Beatles, but by their followers. And that often induces paranoia and certainly induces fantasy. And it was all part of that. They also, I think it's almost impossible to underestimate their fame and the influence on people's lives. So you just read, I put 3 or 4 just fan stories, well, lots of fan stories in the book, but 3 or 4 whole chapters just for particular fans. And they inhabited people's dreams, their ambitions. People would go to India because the Beatles went to India. They'd take up Eastern religion because they did. They'd grow their hair long. They'd have moustaches. They were so influential, way beyond anything you can imagine today.
But from the fans' point of view, is that amount of celebrity great? Because I thought it was rather brilliant and that the fans were having a great time, mainly screaming away. And that was rather marvellous. I
think so. And you only have to see the film of the rooftop concert in Let It Be. And
to see how much they loved it.
How excited everyone was in the street.
I can see Brett is wanting to ask some readers' questions, but I've got one last thing that I just wanted to say.
No, plenty of time, so far away.
Oh, good. I love how you interspersed the words of the time to try and really root this in when it was happening. And so the words were, the words, I'd written some of these down. Yes, in the 1960s, the words that entered the dictionary were druggy and permissive society. And yet by 1970, the words that entered the dictionary were property developer and my favorite, chicken brick, which slightly spuriously, I thought, but hilariously, taken as a whole great thing on how without the Beatles, the world was going to be a much duller place.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, the chicken brick would have been invented without the Beatles, I think. But it's interesting. I wanted to show how the world moved very, very quickly between 1952 and 1970, and those things. Well, it's like property developer and chicken brick show a completely different world. And they did move it forward in a way that beyond any politician or anything. I think they did alter the world. It sounds like a bogus thing that rock journalists say, but I think the world actually, I think Obama said it in a speech. He said the world without the Beatles would have been a very different place.
Okay, so if you think it moved it forward, can you tell us, without reading 600 pages, exactly how?
Well, certainly in terms of pop music, everyone, including the Rolling Stones, as I was explaining, was following. I think the whole hippie movement was very much based around them. If they came out against Vietnam, then the youth would. I think it was the youth being against Vietnam, which then brought it to an end eventually. There are different the breakout of the more permissive society, whether good or bad. I think that was John and Yoko appearing naked. It just and no pop star's done that since then. It might have been a very bad idea.
So that didn't change the world. That did not.
Don't get the or something appearing naked, thank goodness. But, and so in good ways and bad ways. But I'm sure they did. And I have also there are quotes from Gorbachev and Putin and Yeltsin, I think, both saying, all three saying that they did change Russian society, and the youth realized that the Beatles stood for freedom. And there was a big black market in their records. And those Soviet leaders did think that they had changed the whole atmosphere in the Soviet Union. to be against the Soviet Union.
No, I think I've been hogging questions too long.
No.
We can have some readers' questions as well.
Excellent. I'm gonna jump in. So I've got a couple that come through from Paul here, Paul Holder. Did your opinion or understanding of any of the Beatles change from when you started this project to when you completed it?
Yes, I think before I saw them as I did when I was sort of 10 or 11. I thought they were kind of grown-ups. But now I realize, as I was writing it, they were all under the age of 30. But by the time they split up, they were kids. And so if we thought, well, you know, they shouldn't have appeared naked or they shouldn't have taken so many drugs, well, that's what you do when you're that young. And then they would start. Of course, they couldn't operate a big company like Apple without the help of someone like Brian Epstein. Of course, it was going to be absurd, and of course, it was eventually going to fail. So I became much more forgiving of their excesses, and with the amazing pressure on them, pressure in every way. I think it's amazing that they came out comparatively normal and comparatively untarnished by things.
Thank you. And then, but a comment and a question from David James. He says, "I'm enjoying 1, 2, 3, 4, the Beatles in Time a great deal. 2 chapters on the Beatles' dental associations might seem excessive, but every page brings joy." And his question is, to many, the Beatles led a charmed life, huge fame and wealth, loved by millions. But what is striking from your book is how much sadness and tragedy surrounds each one of them. After finishing the book, were you envious of the Beatles, or did you feel rather sorry for them?
Well, there was tragedy, though. I mean, some of that was in their childhoods. You know, with Paul and John both having lost their mothers, which may then well have been the sort of the spur they needed. Can you still hear me?
Yes, absolutely, no problem.
Okay. And then obviously 10 years later, John was assassinated. I wouldn't have thought they had an undue amount of tragedy. I was trying to think what you would have been thinking of. I mean, obviously the friction between them was almost going to be inevitable. You couldn't say that was tragic. That's just human nature. On the subject of the dentist, there are in fact 4 different dentists, oddly enough. One who's rather overlooked is John had a rich uncle who was a dentist in Edinburgh, and he gave John, I think it was something like £200 for his 21st birthday, with which he took Paul. This is way before they were famous. Took Paul to Paris, and in Paris they got the Beatles haircut. So actually, without a dentist, you might not have got the Beatles haircut.
Brilliant. And there's one just come in. It's quite an interesting question. Do you think their accent was a key to their success?
No, I wouldn't have thought it was a key to their success, but it certainly kind of certainly there was something about their Liverpudlian roots which made them. I think Liverpool is a particularly special city, and part of their success worldwide was the fact that they were so uncowed by things. So up until then, all working class dramas and kind of John Osborne-y things always showed these they weren't angry. And it just showed them, and they weren't cowed. If they were at an American press conference, having got off the plane, never having been to America before, they weren't cowed by it. They were just themselves. And there's something completely delightful about that. If you look at them doing their early press conferences or in their films, they are just themselves. And I think they gave, this might sound grandiose or pompous, but in a way they gave the working class people just the ability to be themselves and not just be seen as portrayed on screen as servants or as angry hooligans. And so in that's another way they changed the 60s. It did become more clusters.
But the transcripts of those press conferences are in the book, and they are so delightful. But one of the loveliest things, and this goes back to the Beatles maybe not being tragic at all, was I genuinely believed that they were having the laugh of their lives during that time. Did you think that, Craig? Until it went awful, it sounded hilarious and that they enjoyed it.
I think they were, and a great Daunt's regular, Eleanor Bron, who's a friend of mine, who obviously was with them on Help, but she said it was just a lovely time. Everyone in the Bahamas filming Help, they loved the Beatles. The Beatles got on with everyone. It was just a very happy occasion. So I think it's wrong because we're so used to the breakup. I think there was a very happy time. It was them against the world in some ways. Well, and they were just a little kind of band of brothers all undergoing. And it was only those four, I think Ringo said, they were the only four who understood what they were all going through. And so there was a great sense of camaraderie, and then that disappeared. But I think that was inevitable.
I've got one more, and then I've got a question for both of you. So the first one is from Simon Loris, who says, can you always tell who is singing when you listen to the Beatles?
Yes, but unless he's got a kind of trick question up his I think it's yes. I think Paul's voice is obviously very sort of melodic, and John has this great kind of rasping voice. It's harsher, but it's very kind of unique. And then obviously George's is softer, and Ringo's is the sort of plodding Thomas the Tank Engine one. But he doesn't sing very well.
And then finally, because we're almost out of time, favourite Beatles track from both of you?
Oh God, I'm going to give you time. Oh, no, Craig, you go and you give me time.
Well, I just love Hey Jude. John Updike said it was like the sun coming out on Easter morning, and I think it just has that's another one where the lyrics don't make a great deal of sense, but it just has the feeling of great elation and solidarity, and I find that very moving still.
Well, having now watched that video many times after reading the book, I love that too. But I'm going to be really annoying and not give an answer, because what this has done to me is allowed me to rediscover the Beatles, and maybe to think I was too dismissive as a child. And I am listening to the whole blinking lot of them, the whole collection. I've got it all on Spotify. I'm singing along to all of them. That's as good as I'm going to go.
Even Bungalow Bill.
Bungalow Bill. And Rocky Raccoon, and even Her Majesty.
Rocky Raccoon, listening to that today. Yes,
which I
Bungalow
discovered.
Bill actually is a good example of a song which has a merry. They were very good at songs which had merry tunes and dark lyrics, and that's or the other way around, and that's what makes them very interesting, among the other things.
Yeah, I say I've discovered Her Majesty the other day, which I'd forgotten about. It was one of those things when you're very young, you're obsessed with the things that turn up at the end of a record when it goes into the middle. This track turns up, doesn't it? Her Majesty. It turns up when it's sort of the needle goes right the way across, and suddenly Paul pops up singing about the Queen. Rather fun. Thank you both very much. This has been a huge pleasure, and the book is wonderful, really, really enjoyable. As with all your books, unexpected people popping up. We haven't got time talking about it. I love the Alex Mardos. I think Mardos is a fantastic figure who I'd never come across before. And as ever with your books, it's the marginal figures. It's the people who would normally be ignored in the ordinary biographies, which you bring out, and which then makes the whole subject work so much better. And I think it's why we read your books. Just a huge pleasure. Lucy, thank you very much for putting the questions. Really entertaining, and I think exactly the way to do these things. They have to be fun. Thank you very much, both indeed, and good night to you all. Thank you.
Massive pleasure. I've got more listening to do now.